Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you first to Andrew for accepting to do this to help create an awareness about sustainability, about saving the planet, about saving the next generation and not just this current generation. Thank you to everyone who's left their jobs to be here or who had to take permission. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Yomi. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Oluwafumike, Andy, Olajumoke Akinwumi. Thank you to everyone. I may not be able to mention everybody's name, but at some point, we'll have to ask Andrew all the questions we have. So this is not about me talking, it's about all of us who are on this call to ask questions about whatever area of sustainability we want to find, answers to. So within 60 minutes, I'll be talking about why I ventured into this. I'm a sustainability ambassador for the Sustainability UK promoters and collaborators. So I've done about 16 webinars. This is the 16th webinar about creating awareness for sustainability, about the SDG goals, about women empowerment, about saving the planet. So we all know about the SDG goals, so I'm not going to be boring you about that. So this has started in 2020, where I have webinars for employability skills training, webinar for women who want to run their businesses, who want to have work-life balance. And on this call, we have Women in Business, a group that I'm a member of, where we talk about empowering women to set up their businesses. It's a small community that we have on WhatsApp and within my faith and believing community. So why sustainability? Sustainability has to do with us enhancing our standards of living, safeguarding our ecology, and protecting our natural resources, not just for this generation, but for future generations. So we want to be able to acknowledge the need to protect our natural resources, advance our renewable energy, to reduce waste, to have a sustainable economy where practices across a range of industry have a standard to drive sustainability and motivate everyone to have a strong sense and that obligation of being able to leave the current and future generations with a planet that is more, moral and habitable for everyone. So today I'm joined by Andrew, our Sustainability Director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa at Microsoft Corporation. Andrew leads Microsoft's work on sustainability, policy, context, and the corporation's commitment to the environment and energy. So I'll just say a few things about Andrew, but later he will also introduce himself. Andrew has over 30 years of experience in software industry innovation, business development, sales, and management. Andrew is passionate about sustainability, he's passionate about partnership, and he understands what data-driven value generation is all about. He has led a high impact teams within consultancy, within architecture, and within data science. Andrew is a CEO. Andrew is a managing director. Andrew is a business development and a center of excellence leader. Andrew has the foreign education in MIT business engineering, electrical engineering. He has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to complex technologies. Andrew has an INSEAD MBA with a focus on innovation and international management. Andrew is an Institute of Directors. He has an Institute of Directors diploma in company direction. So anything you want to learn about directing your organization, setting up a business, having a startup. Andrew is also my mentor. I met Andrew while I was doing my MBA. He gave a lecture about digital platforms, and that, inspired me to want to learn more about digital banking, anything digital. So if you need to know anything about digital, I think Andrew is also the best person to speak to. So on this fireside session, we'll be exploring industry insights that covers areas around sustainability, the definition of sustainability, ESG, greenhouse gases, the scope 1, scope 3 emissions, carbon emissions, and I know we all have a lot of questions. So without further ado, Andrew, I'd like you to just maybe introduce yourself. Let's take it away. Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah. Thanks, Felicia. I'm not sure there's anything to add after all the information that you gave there. I think you summed it up nicely. I've been in business for a heck of a long time. The gray hair to prove that. I've done a number of roles, both in smaller companies, leading startups and founding my own companies, but the last 15 years have really been spent in large organizations like SAP and Microsoft, where I'm lucky to work with a whole range of different customers. And the focus these days is very much around sustainability, around energy transition. Most of my work is in the energy space. So I'm working a lot with oil and gas companies, with electricity providers, with renewable energy companies. So really excited to be here today. I think after we met a couple of years ago on your MBA program, we've had lots of chats about how we can move things forward, and I'm glad it's happened today.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So let's start with one question. Should we go professional first, or should we go personal first? Because we have a lot of questions for you. How you started your sustainability career. I've got a lot of people who have asked. So we want to see like a vote. I'm going to be checking on the chat. If I have more people asking for your professional background or more people asking about your personal background, then we'll start with whichever has the highest votes. So can we quickly vote? We've got 1 hour for this session, so we need to move quickly. Those who want Andrew to first, talk about how he started sustainability career, or those who want to talk about his personal, development in this area. Let's see. I'm checking on the chat.
I think they overlap quite a lot. So.
Okay. All right. So let's just start with, tell us about sustainability and how you found yourself in this space of sustainability.
So when I started at Microsoft about 5 years ago, I started in a role which was an industry advisor to the energy industry, and it was pretty obvious that that one of the big things on people's agendas was this energy transition. One of the things that we learned quite quickly is companies were really interested in Microsoft's own sustainability story, our transition story, if you like. If you think about Microsoft about 7 or 8 years ago, we were known for things like Office and so on, and we've really transformed into this this cloud, this data first type company. So there was an interest in that. How do you change your business model? Lots of oil and gas companies are thinking about what's the future of my business as I move forward, and how do we do the change management in order to make that happen. But the other thing that people were really interested in was Microsoft was a pretty early mover on lots of topics around sustainability. So we launched our first sustainability report in 2012. We've been carbon neutral since then, and we'll come back to talk about what that means. But we've made some really bold commitments in the last few years, and a lot of customers were saying, how do you do that? How do you do that and still make money, right? And how does that translate into good business? How do you even kind of capture the data so that you understand what progress you're making or what your footprint is? And so we were bringing more and more customers, very often as part of a visit to our headquarters in Redmond, or maybe in discussions with them. And they said, so what is, tell us a little bit more about your sustainability journey, and then let's talk about how we can learn a bit from that, or learn from each other. So that's how I got started on this. And then, I think at the same time, in general, there's been more and more awareness from a general population that, we need to live life in a way that doesn't harm the generations that come after us. And there are lots of things that we want companies to do, whether that's improve, reduce packaging and so on. There are lots of things that governments need to do, but there are also lots of things that we as individuals can also contribute. So I started reading books like How Bad Are Bananas, which is, Maria, I see you laughing there, but it's a great book because it, we all have a kind of a feeling in our head. If someone says, how much does a pint of milk cost? You have a number in your head about what the economic price is. What you don't have is what is the carbon price for that, right? What is the emission footprint of eating a banana? And so it's a nice book to kind of give you a little bit of a flavor of, okay, if I do something, what is the impact that's having? It's a nice framework. So it was one of the many books. Yeah, I think some of the other ones that are really great, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. So this Bill Gates book, he gives a really nice framework about thinking about the climate challenge that we face. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of how I got started.
Yes, it does. So there's another question about what are the environmental topics? Because I remember when I had an assignment on sustainability, and that was really my first, like an assignment where I had to think through, bring up initiatives about sustainability. And I remember you talked about how do we even measure that one tree that has been planted or 20 trees planted by a particular company is not being calculated as being planted by another company. So how do we actually measure what those environmental impacts are? What are those topics we need to focus on as organizations?
So when you think about environmental, the environmental side of the ESG, probably the biggest topic, or the ones that people focus on initially is carbon emissions, right? Carbon is one of the issues. There are things like nitrous oxide. There are lots of other greenhouse gases that are contributing to the problem. And just to kind of quickly summarize it, a lot of our industrial processes generate these chemicals, these gases, and the problem is that these gases, until about 50 years ago, we were able to absorb as much as we were producing through everything from forests to oceans and so on. That balance has tipped, and so we're creating more greenhouse gases than we can absorb easily through nature. And these greenhouse gases are kind of creating a blanket around our whole planet, and as a result, we're seeing significant climate change issues. I think we all saw it this summer, right? Almost every week there's been a record temperature for a certain day this year. So these greenhouse gases are probably the primary things that we talk around from an environmental perspective, but then there's also water, there's waste, and there's biodiversity. Those are the other three really big topics that we think about. So, just as an example, if someone wants to develop a new wind farm, one of the questions that's being asked is, how is that affecting the fish habitats, the fish ecosystem? Can you prove that you're not putting those ecosystems at risk? Similarly, lots of processes use water in large quantities, and we need to make sure, especially in areas that are water distressed, where the natural levels of water reservoirs are dropping, that we don't overuse that resource, because without it we can't live. So E is really about anything that affects the environment, and the big drivers are greenhouse gases, it's water, it's waste, it's biodiversity.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'll just go through the other questions that have come in, and then Maria, get ready. You may need to just do a little bit of, maybe you want to ask a question, because one of your questions are also here. The next question now is, how do we actually measure carbon footprints?
That's a really good question. So there are different ways of doing it. One is to actually, there are standards put in place by something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which allow you to translate different types of business activities into carbon emissions. So I talked before about the different greenhouse gases. In order to create some kind of overall way of measuring it, we talk about carbon dioxide equivalents, right? So COE. And so every activity that we undertake as a company has a carbon impact. We separate that out into what we call 3 scopes. And the different scopes, scope 1 is everything that you're doing as a company to drive your operations, right? So whether it's light or it's heating or cooling your buildings, it's operating the fleets that are delivering your products. Those are the things that you control directly. So that's scope 1. Scope 2 is all about the energy that you buy, right? So it makes a big difference. Your carbon footprint is largely affected by the energy that you consume and where that energy comes from. So if you're getting your energy from a coal-fired plant, that's different than if you're getting your energy from hydro or from wind or from nuclear even. So that's scope 2. Scope 3 is both the most difficult and usually by far the biggest area, which is really thinking about the complete value chain of your company, right? How do I make my products? If you think about the laptops that we're all using right now, as Microsoft, we have to think about what are the raw materials being used to make those. What is the carbon footprint of the companies that are providing those materials to us? But we also have to think about what is the energy being consumed when people are using the laptops for the 5 or 10 or however many years after they buy them. So we actually model lots of things about how much energy will a customer of a Surface laptop actually consume over the next 5 years, and then we'll put in some kind of calculation that says, if it's in the UK, then there's this mix of renewable energy. If it's in another country, we'll take that into account in order to figure out what the carbon impact is of what we call downstream operations, right? So anything after the product is bought. So that's the way of thinking about it. We think about these 3 scopes. We translate everything into carbon equivalents.
Thank you so much. So the next question here says, what are the latest trends when it comes to developing sustainable or sustainability reporting strategy? What are the trends we need to be aware of?
So the big issue, and there's a bunch of reporting that is just coming into place right now. Especially from the European Union, they've launched something called CSRD, so Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which means that there are 50,000 companies that are going to have to provide reporting about carbon and about ESG in total almost to the same level that they're providing financial reporting today, right? And that's a huge change. What we're finding with most companies is some of them have tools in place, but most of them have Excel in place, right? So they're gathering data and they're keeping it in Excel and communicating about these numbers in emails, and that's not really scalable. I'll just give you an example. I've worked with a customer in the logistics industry, and one of their customers has said, "We want you to be able to prove to us that we're using the greenest transport lanes possible." They have 2 full-time people doing nothing but collecting the carbon data around their logistics for that one customer, right? They have about 5,000 customers. How's that going to scale? It doesn't, right? So what we're finding is that customers are realizing that the ways they're capturing data today, they're managing their data is not scalable, and it's not robust enough. If you think about financial reporting systems, if someone comes back to you in 3 years or in 5 years' time and said, "How did you get to that number?" Right? They need you to be able to prove that. And if all you're doing is collecting things in Excels and sharing them in emails and everyone's allowed to make changes, then you're not going to have that level of accuracy, consistency, of transparency. So I think what we're seeing is a realization for companies that as these reporting regulations come into place, they need to put in much more robust systems to be able to capture the data. They're also realizing, especially with Scope 3, that it's not just about their data, right? They need to be able to talk to all their suppliers and understand where they're sourcing their raw materials and what kind of work practices they have in place. So there's this huge network effect. If you really want to understand your carbon emissions, you need to be working with your suppliers and with your customers and understanding their carbon footprints. If you think about, if I just take Microsoft as an example, 96% of our carbon emissions come from Scope 3, right? Come from upstream or downstream. It's come from our supply chain, come from distribution and transport and so on, come from the concrete that we use in our data centers. All of those kinds of things are huge contributors. Only 4% come from the combined scopes 1 and 2. So this is a team effort, right? And I think that's the other thing that people are starting to understand much more clearly now.
Thank you so much for answering that. So there's a question from Andy Holyland. Andy, thank you for joining. He says, "I'll be interested to understand Andrew's explanation of the difference between carbon neutral and being net zero."
And being net zero. So, I think that it's a matter of degree. So, carbon neutral, people started using that term kind of 20, 30 years ago, and the main way that they were using it is they were looking primarily at scope 1 and 2 emissions, and they were saying any emissions that we're creating, we're going to offset, right? So we'll plant some trees, or we will buy, and this is, I think, the other interesting topic. Everyone has emissions that are expected from their industry or company, and if they produce less of it than expected, then they have a credit, and you can kind of buy or trade those credits. In fact, for a long time, Tesla, as an automotive manufacturer, was actually making more money trading their carbon credits than they were actually selling cars, right? So they would trade it to the likes of GM or Ford or whoever who who were creating larger carbon emissions than they were allowed, and so they were buying these carbon credits. So this idea of carbon neutral is, here are my carbon kind of emissions. I'm going to offset them by either avoiding other emissions, by not growing them. When we start talking about net zero, it still uses offsets, but the main emphasis is, how do we reduce carbon emissions to a minimum possible, right? Either through more efficiency, to moving to, in the case of transportation, it's moving to sustainable aviation fuel. Lots of things that we can do to lower the carbon emissions, and then offset what we can't get rid of. There are some things that there are some industries, for example, that just you can't get to net zero today, right? Things like cement or steel, lots of those kind of industries, you just can't get there. And so using offsets or using carbon removal techniques is another way of reaching net zero. And then there is the next step, which is carbon negative, right? How do you remove more carbon than you actually emit? And so just to give you an idea of maybe some of the timeframes around here, in Microsoft's journey, we became carbon neutral in 2012, right? Which meant we were buying offsets in order to make up for our carbon emissions. We have committed to being carbon negative by 2030, which means that we need to remove more carbon than we emit, and that's all across all three scopes, right? So in the case of Microsoft, we're reducing our scope 3 emissions by 50%. That's working with suppliers. That's working, that's improving, standby and on PlayStations and Surface laptops and so on. And then we buy millions of tons of carbon removal, right? So this is the third thing that we're doing in order to become carbon negative. And we've also said, actually, we've been operating for 40 years. We've created some carbon emissions. So by 2050, we've committed to actually erasing all our historical carbon, right? So we will, by 2050, it'll be as if, from a carbon perspective, Microsoft never was never on the planet at all. So really ambitious goals. I think, personally, I think the goal of reducing scope 3 by 50% by 2030 is the most challenging, the most ambitious of them.
Thank you. Andy, does that answer your question, Andy Holyland?
Yes, thank you very much. It was really good to hear, and I think it clarified it perfectly. I think from my perspective, it seems like a lot of people are using those terms interchangeably at the minute, and it does cause some confusion. So it was very good to get an explanation. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you. So the next question here is, someone says, I feel it's high time corporations take sustainability seriously. So how can we check that and ensure there's no greenwashing?
It's a good question. So I think there are a couple of things that we can do. We talked a lot about sometimes the greenwashing is intentional, sometimes it's unintentional, right? So it's I think the lack of good data capture tools, of good ways of gathering that data from our suppliers leads to a lot of unintentional greenwashing. I think the biggest, at least what we see, this new legislation. The UK has something similar. They have the Task Force on Climate Directive, so TCFD. So there are lots of reporting requirements that are coming into place with real teeth, right? So this is is not just nice to have anymore, which, you know, in the past, a lot of the reporting has been voluntary. A lot of the programs have been voluntary. It's not anymore, right? This new regulation is coming in, is saying you need to report on this. So I think that's one really big driver for it. I think the other thing that's really interesting, and Maria probably has something to say on this as well, is that investors and banks are paying a lot more attention to this. And you know, we're seeing companies that don't have a responsible strategy, and not just kind of strategy, but actually showing some progress towards those goals. They're getting punished in the financial markets, right? So their cost of capital is going up. They're not getting the same kind of investment terms as those companies that are that have proper programs in place. And I would say the final thing is consumers are starting to vote with their feet, right? So we're starting to see more and more consumers that are choosing not to buy from certain companies because of, you know, whether it's carbon emissions or it's some of the social side, whether it's modern slavery or similar things. They're really moving, you know, they're moving away to more eco-conscious brands. And so I think those are the three kind of big drivers towards improving the level of reporting. But I would love to hear Maria's view on that.
You actually took one of the questions that I was just about to ask, Andrew. But you're absolutely right. So I work in the financial sector, and that's exactly what we're seeing. There is an increased demand for sustainable investing. So people are really wanting to make sure that their money is basically put where their values are. So it's not just about profit anymore. It is very much about profit, wealth, not harming the planet or doing good for people on the planet, you know, which is probably the way that we would refer to most in the bank. It's so you'll need to make sure that you're starting to embed sustainability into everything you do. And my question following from that is, I find that one of the biggest challenges is we know that customers want more sustainable offerings. We know that they are demanding a lot more from their banks, the companies where they buy everything. But within organizations, it's still very difficult to move sustainability within the organization. So I find that it's very challenging to be able to move quick enough, because obviously there's always too much going on, right? There's always like a million priorities, and then sometimes sustainability continues to be an afterthought, right? So you go through all of the process of designing products or designing an incredible value proposition, and then at the end of it, somebody says, well, how about sustainability? When the reality should be sustainability should be from the get-go, right? So when you start to think about anything, how do you then embed sustainability? Just as you embed risk into everything, how sustainability becomes part of that. So I'd be interested to hear a bit more about what's the approach within Microsoft for that.
So it's a really good question, and I mean, especially around things like product. I think something like 80% of the carbon impact is determined at the design phase, right? So if you get that wrong, then you're just dealing with the consequences of that. One of the things that we did early on, and I think we see a lot of companies doing this now, is creating this idea of an internal carbon tax, right? So the idea behind it is, we're all business people, right? And so in general, we've been trained to make decisions that are in the best financial interest for the company. And so in order to maybe kind of influence behavior, we actually created this idea of, we didn't create, we adopted this idea of an internal carbon tax that said, we're going to measure the carbon of your operations. So anyone who owns a P&L within the company, whether it's one of the countries or one of the subsidiaries, and that is going to hit your profit and loss statement, right? So that tax, it's not a funny money tax. This is money that comes out of their P&L and gets put into, in our case, it goes into a climate innovation fund, right? So that we use it to invest in new technologies. We started it in 2012. We set a price of $8 per metric ton. We doubled it in 2019. We extended it 2 years ago to scope 3. That was all of a sudden, our procurement colleagues had very different agendas when going and talking with their suppliers. So I think this idea of a carbon tax is a really nice one, because we're not valuing the carbon emission side as much as the financial side. And so if we can translate that carbon emissions into a financial number, then hopefully we'll start shifting our behavior.
Yeah, and I think that makes absolute sense. And a lot of the things that I see across not just the financial sector, but across other industries, is a similar approach whereby you would include sustainability KPIs as part of your reward system in any company. So it's not just about hitting the numbers, but actually how does your business area or the product or the offering that you're launching is actually supporting your sustainability strategy. So I think once people have that, if you don't measure it, nothing gets done. So it's the moment you see there, it's like, okay, I need to start paying attention, and I need to make sure that I take this into account when I start to look into designing new propositions. So I think it's a very innovative way to do it. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I completely agree that compensation drives behavior. If it doesn't hit their compensation, there's less likely to be a move. So really good insight there. Thank you.
Okay, so having talked about customers and the business and how to drive the bottom line, the triple P, people, profit, and the planet, how does sustainability really affect customers? So yes, we say companies have to be aligned. What importance is this to their customers?
So I guess we see different companies approaching this in different ways, right? I don't know. There was a wonderful story about this sports jackets company called REI that has actually become a not-for-profit company. They're actually putting in all their gains into a trust that is going to be working towards climate goals. But we're starting to see more companies thinking about how do we repair things instead of replace them, right? I think that this is one of the big issues across lots of industries, not least the electronics industry. If something fails on your laptop, what do? You replace it, right? There's hardly ever any repair anymore. Can I just replace the screen? Is it just the hard drive? Is it just this? So there's much more emphasis and pressure on people who are designing products to make them in such a way that they take more responsibility for the full life cycle of the product, right? What happens at the end of it? Working with a wind turbine manufacturer that is making, that is looking into things like how do we build turbines out of wood instead of steel to reduce the impact? Or how do we recycle blades, right? Because you can imagine some of these blades are longer than a football field, a football pitch. So, 100 meters plus long. And there are lots of them out there. So, what are we going to do with them when they finish their life? So I think there are different impacts along the value chain. How do we design products differently? How do we transport products differently? I don't know if you saw the launch of the new Apple Watch. They're talking a lot about its carbon footprint, saying how much they're shifting from air transport to sea transport, which has much lower carbon impact. It's about things like packaging. We've seen things like plastic bags are pretty much gone away. So just reducing the packaging, we'll see more of that moving forward. And we'll see more companies taking responsibilities for the end of life of their products. I think in clothing and fashion, we're starting to see much more interest in kind of recycled clothing or reuse, instead of just replacing everything.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for answering that. So there's another question from Jimmy Onyemiram. Jimmy is the MD of Bridgeways Group. It's an estate management company. They build and they construct large and high-rise buildings. So Jimmy would like to know, can you recommend a standard template for measuring carbon footprint of a company?
I think there are a number of different frameworks out there. So I think it really starts with understanding the framework. So science-based target initiative. It's probably easier to take that one offline. If you want to get in touch with me, I can talk you through, or I can point you to the different frameworks that are used in order to get the right standards for carbon monitoring. It's a relatively technical discussion, and there are lots of options.
Jimmy, does that answer your question, or do you have any other thoughts?
No, that's perfect. So I'll seize the opportunity to speak with Andrew directly on this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So Donald has also asked a question. Donald says, "Hi Andrew, I'm a finance professional, and to me it seems like the conversation of sustainability reporting is not garnered as much global attention, except in a few countries like in the UK and the US that are kind of big on this. Is there an expected global acceptance that we should foresee, or is it just going to happen anytime sooner?" I hope that's straightforward.
Yeah. So you're right. It is happening in the US, in Europe, in the UK more quickly than in other countries. I think there are two things on that, right? So one is there is the issue of equity as well, right? In some ways, it's the Western the countries, the Europes and the US's and some of the bigger countries that have been the biggest culprits or the biggest polluters, or the biggest kind of generators of the carbon emissions. And unfortunately, it's they are not necessarily the ones that are feeling the most pain out of these climate changes, right? So the economic South, the people whose livelihoods depend on farming and water and so on, they're the ones that are most affected by these changes. So I guess the other thing is that some of these countries are the ones where the carbon emissions are still growing fastest. So in some ways, we need to do something across the world in order to make this happen. I think there are two things. So one is we've seen this with other regulation, right? So regulation that initially came in Europe has started to trickle around and to influence regulations in other parts of the world. We saw it with GDPR, right? With our data protection rights. It was something that was developed here. And then soon after that, you saw other countries starting to say, actually, that's a good idea. You know, we're going to take a lot of those ideas and embed them there. Is it moving quickly enough? No, nothing is moving quickly enough for addressing climate change, right? We need to do, you know, stealing from a movie or a film title, everything, everywhere, all at once. You know, we need to do everything. We need to be reducing energy. We need to be reducing consumption. We need to increase the options of carbon removal. We need to do everything, all of those things, as quickly as we can, because we're running out of time.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We've got 15 minutes and questions are rolling in. So the next question is from Toby Olajide. Toby is asking what your take is on this. He says there is a thought that these sustainability conversations are for economies that have become self-sustaining. And these economies are now pushing these agendas to the developing countries without thinking about the growth and development of these poorer economies. So what's your take on this?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that. It is about this equity, right? So it's very easy for us to say, you know, sitting in the UK, you know, you should move away from coal plants to renewable energy. We didn't do it, but you should. We didn't do it kind of 20 or 30 years ago or 5 years ago when when we had the chance, but you need to do it now, and you need to do it quickly. And I think it is a real challenge, right? I think there's been lots of pressure on in international forums that some of the countries who have contributed more to the problems that we have today actually do some, you know, provide some financial compensation to incentivize countries that are still very much in the middle class growth phase to make sustainability choices which are not always in line with, you know, with the easiest and fastest ways to economic growth. So I do think that we have some responsibility. I don't think we're stepping up enough to it. I think there will be more tension between let's say, the developing and developed countries on this matter. I don't think there is an easy solution. I think we should be doing more. We're not yet.
All right. Toby, does that answer your question? Okay, so there's another question here from Paul Oyewusi. Paul says, hello, Andrew. I'm the HR manager for a fintech company in Nigeria. I'd like to know how carbon footprint can be generally reduced in a fintech environment.
So, I mean, lots of things. In some ways, I think technology is one of the big drivers, or one of the big opportunities for us to do something to reduce carbon emissions. I think we saw that definitely with remote working, right? So we're traveling less. We're using things like Teams and so on more. It was actually accelerated by COVID that taught us that we could do that we could do things in very different ways. You know, even, you know, large companies very often have kickoffs at the beginning of the year. They used to fly, you know, 10,000 people out to Las Vegas. And that's not happening anymore, right? And people are doing things remotely, and they're finding different ways of creating that that same kind of spark. So on one side, we're seeing people move, recognize the impact that things like remote working are having. I think technology is having a big impact on kind of renewable energy and renewable sources. I think the other really big thing, and I'm a huge believer in the need for carbon removal, right? So whether there are things like direct air capture, so big fans that capture carbon directly from the atmosphere, and they turn it into, they turn it into a form that can be pushed down and mineralized in rocks, right? So a different way of capturing carbon and transforming it and getting rid of it in that way. There are other technologies like carbon capture and storage, where we're capturing carbon in smokestacks and liquefying it, and then kind of injecting it back into the depleted oil reservoirs, so that it's captured for hundreds of thousands of years. So I think technology has a huge role to play, partly to help us reduce our energy consumption. We're seeing, if you recognize, or if you see that a heat exchanger, for example, or a motor isn't operating at top capacity, then actually repairing it or replacing it lowers the carbon footprint. All of this is driven by, how do I capture the data earlier, faster, better, in order to make those changes proactively. So I think tech has a big role to play. I think as tech providers, we also have a role to play in terms of setting examples, right? Because we can afford to. We have a lot of the capabilities to capture the data and to share that with other people, and so we have that responsibility. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I hope that answers your question. So there's one final question before we go on to the career opportunities that are available in the sustainability sector. So Toby Olajide has said that sustainability from the whole conversation is looking more like responsibility of the corporate. What's the role of the individuals and communities in this journey towards net zero?
Yeah, so I think that coming back to everything, everywhere, all at once, we all need to do something, right? We need to do something at individual levels. We need to do something at the corporate level. And I think that governments have a big role to play as well. In terms of the individual side, I think I would say the biggest thing that we could do to reduce our carbon footprint is to consume less, right? It's as simple as that, right? So instead of changing out your laptop every 3 years or 4 years, maybe you can push it to 5 or 6 or 7, and maybe maybe if things are broken, then let's try and replace them. We're introducing something called circularity centers, so that at the end of the lifetime of a server in one of our data centers, we actually disassemble it and we see which parts we can reuse and which parts we can, in some cases, we actually sell them on. They're not good enough for the data centers, but they're more than good enough for other purposes, use in schools and so on. And in other cases, only at the last point do we get to the point of recycling. And so I think consumers need to vote with their feet, right? You choose companies that have more responsible sustainability strategies. I think everything that we do is not just kind of lowering our carbon footprint, but it's increasing the signals that will motivate other companies and governments to do things as well.
Thank you for clarifying that, Andrew. So as we wrap up, the final question here says, what career opportunities are available in ESG and sustainability? Because a lot of people have wondered, okay, this sustainability strategy, everything about sustainability is growing and is gathering momentum. What are those career opportunities for those who are looking to get into the sector for ESG and sustainability?
So it's a good question, and I think there are two separate answers to that, right? So one is there are huge there's a growing number of roles for sustainability analysts, for sustainability experts, but I think the other thing, and we've talked about it a little bit earlier in the discussion, sustainability has to become a part of everything that we do, right? So thinking about if I'm a designer, right, how do I increase my understanding of sustainability and promote that, right? So, you know, if I'm a designer and I go out and I say, these are the designs that I've created in the past, and here are some of the design choices that I made because of the carbon footprint implications of them. I think those people are going to start to see more opportunities come up. Similarly, in packaging and retailing, in all kinds of industries, if you can demonstrate how you are incorporating and building up your expertise within your line of business, I think you'll see huge opportunities. So don't just think of sustainability in terms of, I need to be part of the sustainability group or the sustainability team. It's much more about, I need to weave sustainability into everything that we do in this company. And so developing that area of the sustainability knowledge and expertise and bringing it into the thing that I'm good at, I think it for a lot of people will be the most productive one.
So if I hear you correctly, you've mentioned that to be part of the sustainability, it doesn't have to be the role of the organization. We need to incorporate this into everything we do, our daily lives, beyond the office space. It has to be something personal. And that's why we're having most of these webinars, to create more awareness. So you don't have to be a sustainability manager, a sustainability strategist. It starts with you. So it's just making that change so that the next generation also benefits from a moral and a habitable environment. I hope, you know, this has been a wonderful session. And I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's taken off the time, most especially to you, Andrew, out of a busy schedule. You've come. I don't know if you have any final thoughts or if anyone else has anything to say. We'll close in 2 minutes because people have to get back to work. Yeah, absolutely. And listen, really appreciate everyone jumping on the call this morning. Some fabulous questions. It's been really good. And thanks, Felicia, for setting this up and bringing us all together. Thank you. Any final questions? Anyone wants to say something? Let me just check the questions here. We've got 2 more minutes. So thank you, everyone. We have to go. And you know, one of the things we talk about sustainability is we want to manage our time. We want to manage the environment. We have to get back to work. We need to make more money. We need to add more to the triple bottom line of organizations, the people, the planet, and the profits. We can't do much by just staying here. So thank you so much, everyone. We'll be sharing the video after this class, after the session. You get emails and notifications on how to watch the recap of this session. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a lovely day. Enjoy your weekend. Bye. Bye.